Do you know if she's coming back? Okay.
Can I squeeze in on this? Somebody else? Somebody sit in? Okay.
Maybe if I sit right here.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
to move over there so I can sit? But you know, the place is set up so people can sit around. Yes, it is. I'm going to show you. You don't. That's what we set up. Well, you know, it's set up so people can sit around.
I mean, if anyone, she probably has to sit here, but she was here. And she's smaller, maybe you can see her better.
Oh, she has to sit. I'll come back.
Thanks. Well, good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and we're very pleased and honored to have Richard Clark here tonight. Richard, if you don't know a lot about his background, you might be interested to learn, has served the last 3 presidents as a member of the National Security Council staff. I think he may be almost unique in that role. Maybe
well,
Rand,
Randy Beers.
Rand would be the other, so
Yeah.
2. He entered federal service in 1973 in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He then came back to MIT to the Defense Policy Program there, which Bill Kaufman ran, where he got his master's. We would have wished that it would have been at the Kennedy School, but we didn't have any such equivalent courses of that quality for sure. He then became a Deputy Assistant Secretary and an Assistant Secretary of State in Political Military Affairs in the administration of George H.W. Bush. And he was under Presidents Clinton and President George W. Bush, the National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism. Now, anybody who's read a newspaper or watched television lately knows that he's also the author of a book that's burned up Amazon.com and the rest of the bookstores, Against All Enemies. And while we're not allowed to advertise books here in the forum, I would just say as a reader that it's a very good read. What we're going to do tonight, Dick said he'd given enough speeches and he would rather do questions and answers. And so I'm going to interview him for about 40 minutes on the general topic of terrorism and the world as we see it today, a topic that we study here at the school and particularly at BCSIA intensely, a topic among other things on which he and Rand Beers are teaching a course here at the school this spring, which they just finished about 5 minutes ago at 6 o'clock. So he's demonstrating a kind of a work ethic which was characteristic of Clark in government, but is not always characteristic of all our professors here. I'm glad to say, since I'm one of them. But in any case, what we're going to do is I've prepared a few questions, some of which will involve a video clip or another from some of Dick or other presentations lately. We'll do short questions and short answers, and then we're going to come to the floor. And the meeting is open. So let me start with the Dick Clark clip, if we can, from his testimony.
What is this, Meet the Press?
This is just Meet the Forum, yes.
The reason I am strident in my criticism of the President of the United States is because by invading Iraq, something I was not asked about by the Commission, but something I chose to write about a lot in the book, by invading Iraq, the President of the United States has greatly undermined the war on terrorism.
At last week's press conference, President Bush had a different take on this issue, and I think we may even have a slide to that effect. Let's see if this works. This is still new equipment for the forum. Have you got that slide? Yes. President Bush said, Iraq is part of the war on terror. It's a theater in the war on terror. And it's essential that we win this battle in the war on terror. By winning the battle, it'll make other victories more certain in the war against the terrorists. So my question is, does the president's argument persuade you yet? Okay.
Well, you said we could have short answers. Let's divide this into two parts. What was the Iraqi-based terrorist threat to the United States before we invaded them? And what has been the effect on the war on terror of invading them? The first part, since 1993, since about June of 1993, through the time when we invaded Iraq, there was absolutely no evidence of the Iraqi government, the Iraqi intelligence services, engaged in any form of support of terrorism directed against the United States. They weren't nice people, and they were certainly supporting terrorism against Israel. But there was no evidence for 10 years of Iraqi government support for terrorism directed against the United States. And by the way, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction for 20 years before it eliminated them. And no evidence during that 20-year period that the Iraqis ever gave weapons of mass destruction to a terrorist group. I don't know why we thought they were about to, because they had never done it. So I thought of all of the places in the world where you could worry about terrorism directed against the United States, Iraq was pretty low on the list. There were other places I would have worried about, Iran being one of them, where Iran has, in fact, engaged in sponsoring terrorism against the United States. That's the first half. The second half, what's the effect on the war on terrorism? The war on terrorism isn't a war on terrorism. It's a civil war within Islam. And there's a small, radicalized group within Islam that wants to attack the rest of the world and attack the moderates within Islam. That's what we're dealing with. And it would seem to me that the last thing you would want to do when you were engaged in a battle to effect a civil war within Islam, when you're already running at 70 and 80% of the Islamic world hating the United States, according to the Pew opinion surveys, the last thing you would want to do would be to invade and occupy an Islamic country. Unless, of course, it were threatening you. But it wasn't threatening us. As Secretary Powell said in February 2001, we had successfully contained Iraq. So it wasn't threatening us. We nonetheless invaded it. By invading it, we did exactly what bin Laden and the Islamic extremists said we would do: invade and occupy an oil-rich Islamic country that was not threatening us. We totally destroyed our credibility in the Islamic world and our ability to work with the Islamic world to fight terrorism. To say nothing of the drain on resources that war has caused, resources which we needed to fight the war on terrorism.
Okay. Let me take you then to the bottom line, because here we're where we are today in Iraq. And let me give you another slide in which you observe that there have been more major al-Qaeda attacks globally in the 30 months since 9/11 than there were in the 30 months preceding it. And that's before the recent spate of both attacks and also preemptions.
Yeah.
So bottom line, are Americans safer from a terrorist attack today than we were on the, let's say, the day after 9/11?
Well, let's look at that quote. There have been many more, as a matter of fact, major al-Qaeda terrorist attacks since 9/11 than there were before. And they've been in places like Bali and Istanbul and Casablanca and Madrid, Moscow, Riyadh. They haven't been in the United States. And I'm often asked, why is that the case? Is it because the FBI has gotten better? Is it because Homeland Security is working? I don't know. And if you get FBI and Homeland Security people aside quietly, privately, I have to meet with them quietly and privately now. They will say that they don't know either.
Right.
They don't know why it hasn't happened. They speculate that Al-Qaeda raised the barrier, raised the hurdle for itself with 9/11, that it doesn't want to do another attack in the United States unless it is a spectacular. And spectaculars are hard to do in the United States now. And it also takes Al-Qaeda many years to plan these spectaculars. But the fact is that globally, Al-Qaeda is not eliminated, it's just morphed. And the reason we're getting these many more terrorist attacks now than we had before is that Al-Qaeda is no longer a centralized hierarchical organization. We know that in the past, if the Al-Qaeda organization was going to attack the USS Cole, the plan for that attack was briefed several times to bin Laden and his Shura Council for approval before authorization was given to do it. That was true of the East Africa embassy bombings, the Cole, it was true of 9/11. So it was a very hierarchical organization. That's no longer the case. And I think we have to assume that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden thought that after 9/11 the United States might do something like occupy Iraq, occupy Afghanistan. And if you look at the years leading up to 9/11, what they did with the organization was they trained somewhere between 40 and 80,000, not a good estimate, but tens of thousands of people in their camps in Afghanistan, and then distributed those people, distributed those trained terrorists around the world to affiliated organizations. And they greatly strengthened those affiliated organizations and taught them how to operate independently. And the attacks that I'm talking about, the attacks in Istanbul and Riyadh and whatnot, Bali, are done by these affiliated organizations that were part of the Al-Qaeda network. So we're now seeing this multi-headed Al-Qaeda operating on its own and doing a lot of damage around the world. You're right, recently a lot of damage has been prevented. A major attack in London was stopped within the last month. Very major attack in London. There was a terrible attack today in Riyadh. One, there were to be 6. So 5 of the attacks that were to have occurred in Riyadh today were stopped. So I think there are indications that things are better in some places. And it's obvious for anybody who flies that you're more secure now on an airplane in the United States than you were prior to 9/11. But are you more secure on a train than you were prior to 9/11? Take the Red Line and find out. It doesn't look any different than it did prior to 9/11. Are you more secure in the sense of what is coming into this country in containers, where we open less than 1% of the thousands, tens of thousands of containers that are shipped into this country every day? On an awful lot of measures, we are not more secure because we haven't spent the money on Homeland Security that we should have spent. It's still a very small program relative to what we need to do to reduce our vulnerabilities here at home.
Okay. Let me take you back to the point you mentioned earlier about bin Laden and what he imagines he's trying to accomplish. So here's from 60 Minutes, Clark on Osama bin Laden. My question is really, are we realizing his vision? You say he's for years been saying America wants to invade an Arab country, occupy it, an oil-rich Arab country. Mm-hmm. So what did we do? We invaded and occupied an oil-rich Arab country, which was doing nothing to threaten us. In other words, we stepped right into his picture, his propaganda. Yeah. So, I mean, if Osama is sitting in his cage somewhere, okay, and he's thinking, obviously he reports out from time to time with these videos, so he stays somewhat aware. Is he thinking, boy, what a wonderful assist we're providing, or what's he thinking?
Well, I think so. You know, one of the greatest experts in terrorism in the world is a French prosecutor named Bruguière, and he said last week that the U.S. invasion of Iraq has done more to fuel Islamic terrorism than anything in history. Or we can ask President Mubarak, who said prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was one bin Laden, and after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there were hundreds. I think absolutely. We had a great window of opportunity after 9/11. We could have taken that tragedy and built on it. Things were happening. In the streets of Tehran, there were spontaneous demonstrations with tens of thousands of people in the streets of Tehran demonstrating their sympathy and their allegiance to the cause of anti-terrorism and their support of the United States after 9/11 in Tehran. It was happening in lots of places around the world. We had an opportunity where the United States could have exercised leadership and united the world in a real battle against this small deviant strain of Islam. And instead, we did incredibly, and when you think about it, exactly the thing that was likely to strengthen the terrorists most. We invaded an Arab country and inflamed opinion throughout the Arab world. And even if we succeed in creating a Jeffersonian, Wilsonian democracy in Iraq, and I'm not betting my mortgage on that, even if we do that, we will, over the course of the many years necessary to do that, have so inflamed Islamic opinion that it will take generations to overcome.
Let me go to the question of strategy in the war on terrorism. And let me do another slide here. This is from Osama bin Laden's video released last week. He says, "This is a message to our neighbors north of the Mediterranean. I offer a reconciliation initiative to them, whose essence is our commitment to stop operations against every country that commits itself not to attack Muslims or interfere in their affairs, including the U.S. conspiracy on the greater Muslim world. The reconciliation will start with the departure of its last soldier from our country." So this is bin Laden's account. Now, as you watch the Madrid bombing, the Spanish election, the announcement of the Prime Minister that Spain's troops are being withdrawn, and subsequent moves, if you were just as a critic watching a chess match, so you see what Osama and Al-Qaeda as a movement even are doing on the one hand, and what the US government and others are doing on the other, what grades would you give to these two hands?
Well, Osama bin Laden also in this audio tape talks about European opinion polls, which is interesting. He at least is following what foreign leaders think about the United States. I think we really underestimate the enemy all too often. We underestimated the enemy in Vietnam. Historically, I think we have a tendency to underestimate the enemy. I would not underestimate the ability of this movement. It's not just one man, it's not just bin Laden. I would not underestimate the ability of this movement to manipulate world opinion. They've studied in the United States, they've studied probably here.
Maybe even at MIT.
Maybe even at MIT. I doubt that. They understand Western technology, they understand Western media, they are very sophisticated. If you look at the number of people with graduate degrees in computer science who have been arrested in the last 3 years as Al-Qaeda operatives around the world, it's a rather startlingly high number. This is not an unsophisticated enemy that's in some high mountain cave, roasting a lamb. These are very sophisticated people who understand how to manipulate the media, who understand how to manipulate Western opinion, who understand how to utilize our technology against us. 9/11 was utilizing our technology against us. It was using our own aircraft and turning them into cruise missiles. So I think they're doing a very effective job on the war for the hearts and minds, not of the European prime ministers, because after this audio tape came out, almost every European prime minister that had troops in Iraq came out the same day and said, we're not going to be blackmailed, the Spanish aside. But that's not the audience. He never really expected that to happen. What they're trying to do is to seem reasonable to the world that they're trying to influence. And they're being very successful in the world that they're trying to influence, which in the first order is the Islamic world, including the Islamic world in Europe, because there is a very, very large population of Muslims now in Western Europe.
Okay. Let me then move on to that, to what the U.S. is doing and the capability of our institutions. I want to do a video clip here this is from one of Dick's interviews on CIA. Can we run that?
The CIA said in their assessments that the attack would most likely occur overseas, most probably in Saudi Arabia, possibly in Israel. I thought, however, that it might well take place in the United States based on what we had learned in December '99 when we rolled up operations in Washington State, in Brooklyn, in Boston. The fact that we didn't have intelligence that we could point to that said it would take place in the United States wasn't significant in my view, because frankly, sir, I know how this is going to sound, but I have to say it, I didn't think the FBI would know whether or not there was anything going on in the United States by Al-Qaeda.
So let me underline that last line, okay? So here we are just before 9/11, and it says here, I didn't think the FBI would know whether or not there was anything going on in the U.S. by Al-Qaeda. So let me put a period by that. And now let me move on to CIA just for a second, because we'll take the two institutions together. Here's another comment from your testimony, which you say, President Clinton was enormously frustrated because he had authorized the assassination of bin Laden and his lieutenants by CIA. But now the 9/11 Commission tells us, to the contrary, their view, quote, every CIA official interviewed on this topic by the Commission, from George Tenet to the official who actually briefed the agents in the field, told us that they heard a different message. They believed the only acceptable context for killing bin Laden was a credible capture operation. Mm-hmm. So as citizens, are we to think our FBI and CIA are essentially broken? And if so, who's responsible for fixing them, and how quickly can this be done?
Well, let's talk about first CIA and divide it into two parts: intelligence collection and analysis on the one hand, and operations like assassination on the other. With regard to the issue of assassinating bin Laden, there was an initial order that President Clinton signed that said to CIA, go and apprehend him, and we understand that in the process of apprehending him, you might have to kill him. There was an initial order to that effect. There were 4 subsequent orders that became increasingly very clear that the goal was not to arrest or apprehend him. And the only reason I think that CIA officials are telling the Commission that they were confused about the intent, or that the authorization wasn't sufficiently clear to them, is because they're covering up the fact that they were pathetically incapable of killing him, and his lieutenants, because his lieutenants were also on the hit list. It was a source of enormous frustration to President Clinton and to his national security advisor that they had crossed this Rubicon, something they really didn't like to do, something they thought very distasteful, to have the United States have a hit list. But they had done it because they thought this threat was really quite extraordinary. And having done it, nothing happened. I would argue the reason for that is not so much a lack of capability on the part of CIA, but a lack of will to do it. CIA, after all, was attacked repeatedly by the Congress and by the media over the course of 20 years for failed covert actions. The former director of CIA, Bob Gates, not Bill Gates.
Not Bill Casey, yes, Bob Gates.
Not Bill Casey. Bob Gates, when he was head of CIA, made no bones about the fact to his institution, to his senior managers, that they should not engage in covert action because he thought clandestine covert action wasn't very successful and had a real high probability of damaging the institution of the CIA. Because of the investigations that always follow and the high probability of failure. I think CIA internalized Gates's guidance. And even though they were being asked to conduct these assassinations, they didn't want to do it. It's not that George Tenet didn't want to do it, I think he did. But the organization, the career CIA, there are very few people in CIA who are not career CIA. There are one or two people appointed at the top who are not. But everybody else has worked their way up in that union. And they had decided covert action was bad and they weren't going to do it. Now, on the intelligence collection side, I think you heard George Tenet say to the 9/11 Commission, it takes a long time to develop a human capability, human intelligence, meaning spies. And he said, we won't have a good capability for 5 more years. And everyone was aghast at that and said, oh, we can't wait 5 more years. Well, you can be all the aghast you want, but it does take a long time to develop good spies, to put them in place, to leave them in place, to have them develop cover. It takes a very, very long time. And we had a failed capability against the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union went away, we stopped that capability, and we didn't really build up a capability to do spy against the new threats. And so we are relying, frankly, on the British, on the Jordanians, on the Spanish, on the Poles, on the Pakistanis to do this job for us. And yes, people should believe that CIA is broken insofar as it cannot do today, and the DCI himself has said so, it cannot do today a good job of spying. It's not easy to do. But it can't do it very well.
And the FBI?
Well, the FBI of 1999 and the FBI of today, I think, are vastly different. When I took a tour of FBI terrorism task forces in 1999, I came to Boston and met with the FBI terrorism task force and said, are there any Al-Qaeda in Boston? Which the answer most certainly was yes. They said, any what? I'm not making this up. And I said, well, what do you guys do here? You're the terrorism task force. Well, they did a lot, apparently, of going to bars in South Boston and following the IRA. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But it demonstrated, and if you went to Seattle, you got a different answer about following Sikh terrorists or something. What it demonstrated was that the 56 field offices of the FBI all were capable of setting their own priorities. And none of them had, with the exception of New York, none of them had as their priority looking for Al-Qaeda. They also had no ability to look in the places where you might find Al-Qaeda. The Attorney General guidelines that had been published in the Ford administration prevented them from opening investigations unless they had something close to probable cause. So they couldn't just say, you know, David Gergen looks like he's a terrorist, and therefore I'm going to open a file on him. And the reason they couldn't was that for years, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, had been saying things like that. and probably did have a file on David Gergen. And so to stop that abuse of J. Edgar Hoover, rules were put into effect that made it very difficult for the FBI to open an investigation, or even a file, which is less than an investigation, without good reason, without evidence. Well, they couldn't get the evidence unless they did the investigation. They couldn't go to places of worship, in this case mosques, to see who was hanging around after the service, handing out literature about the jihad, collecting money for the jihad, urging people to go to Afghanistan to be trained. They couldn't go to the mosques under the Attorney General guidelines at the time. They couldn't go to an internet site just for the heck of it and look at what was on that internet site. So they were obviously limited in their capability. But even within what they could do, they were not doing a very good job. That is vastly different today. Is it different enough? We're going to have to make that judgment, I think, over the course of the next year or two. But this proposal to create an MI5, meaning a domestic intelligence service, it's obviously gaining a lot of popularity, particularly on the 9/11 Commission. And let me just point out two problems with it. It's very hard to create a new federal organization overnight, particularly one that's doing something difficult like intelligence collection. And probably will be much better advised of creating an organization within the FBI, an agency within an agency, that has a different culture and different procedures, and growing that, and maybe someday making it separate. But the other problem with the domestic intelligence organization in the United States is that we need to be very, very careful in our country about civil liberties protection. The American people, thank God, have a very high standard of civil liberties, and we all want to protect that. And so if we're going down the road of creating a domestic intelligence organization, we'd better first figure out how we're going to prevent abuses. We better first figure out how we're going to create enough oversight, active oversight, and transparency into that organization. Transparency into an intelligence organization. Not an oxymoron, but hard. So that if we do create it, either separately or within the FBI, we create it within the tradition of American civil liberties, and we don't end up 20 years from now with another J. Edgar Hoover.
Okay. Let me move to the question about the Saudi connection. So skip one for the slides here. On the Saudi connection, Prince Bandar met personally with President Bush 2 days after 9/11. Same day, while U.S. airspace was closed, a flight took off from Tampa with a group of Saudis on board. Then Craig Unger has published recently a book, House of Bush, House of Saud, in which he says, quote, 3,000 people had just been killed, the toxic rubble of the World Trade Center still ablaze, American airspace was locked down, not even Bill Clinton or Al Gore, who were out of the country, were allowed to fly home. But between September 14 and the 24th, after the airspace had been reopened, about 140 Saudi nationals were flown out of the country, including 20 bin Laden relatives. Now, the commission says the Saudi flights were screened by law enforcement officials, primarily the FBI, to ensure that the people on these flights did not pose a threat to national security, and that nobody of interest to the FBI with regard to the 9/11 investigation was allowed to leave the country. Now, this is the same FBI that you say the week before you don't think would know if Al-Qaeda was in the country or not. So in the light of your analysis of FBI, is it reasonable to believe that the screening procedures succeeded in figuring out whether any of these individuals might have some connection to 9/11 or terrorism that would illuminate this issue?
Well, we've had 30 months since those flights. And if anyone on those flights had turned out to have been a person of interest, which Attorney General Ashcroft's new phrase, a person of interest, if any one of them had been a person of interest, we would know it by now. As far as I know, and I've talked to the FBI about this, it is still the case, 30 months later and having done an awful lot of investigation, that the FBI does not want to interview any of the people who were on those flights. Why did the flights occur in the first place? The American people had just gone through a terrible tragedy, and then they had woken up and realized that the majority of the people who had done the attack were Saudi nationals. We didn't know, and the Saudi government didn't know, how the American people would react to that fact. There was every reason to believe that some large number of the American people would react negatively and violently against Saudis. And I had been, and many of us in the State Department and the White House had been, on the other side of this problem many, many times, when we had American citizens in countries that suddenly became battlefields, and the American citizens were at risk. And many times we reached out and chartered planes, and with the permission of the local government, flew the American citizens out to safety. So we were somewhat, frankly, sympathetic when Saudis asked us, could we evacuate some of our people because they might become victims of vigilantism in the United States. That's the kind of thing that we do all the time to get our people out. But before it happened, we asked the FBI to take a look at all of the names and see if they wanted to hold any of them. Now, many of them, 20 of them, were named bin Laden.
Sorry, let me ask if cell phones be turned off, and if they go on again, I'm going to appropriate them, okay? Thank you.
The fact that many of them were named bin Laden and were in fact part of the large bin Laden clan sounds like a red flag. How could you possibly let bin Laden's brother, sister, cousin, aunt, uncle leave? Well, two things to bear in mind. One is the bin Laden family is enormous, as many Saudi families are. And the other thing to bear in mind is even the FBI prior to 9/11 knew enough to pay, let's say, special attention to people named bin Laden. And so if there were any people in the United States who we would be satisfied we knew a lot about, the members of the bin Laden family probably fell in that category.
Okay. That helps demystify something that otherwise seems fairly mysterious. Let me go to the counterattack, the next point here. There's been a lot of things said about you since you became famous, and most of them are ad hominem, which I think are not particularly interesting. Jim Woolsey tried to see what he could say against what you've argued, and he at least makes an argument about that gets closer to substantive. He says, Clark showed himself not only unwilling to re-examine his judgments based on new information, but intolerant of curiosity. This is alien to the requirement of sound intelligence analysis. Given the position Mr. Clark held, it has done a serious disservice to the war on terror. How would you respond?
Well, I think what Jim is talking about there is his undying belief that Iraq blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. And his belief that I never took that seriously. In point of fact, on about 4 different occasions since 1993, I impaneled groups to look specifically at the question, was there a connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda? Was there a connection between Iran and Al-Qaeda? And as part of the due diligence of running the counterterrorism committee for the federal government, we did say, we don't believe that, but let's investigate it. Let's look at all the evidence, let's put a team together to make the case, as best they can, that Iraq is related to Al-Qaeda, that Iraq blew up the World Trade Center in 1993, etc. We did show curiosity, we did do due diligence, Over the course of the 10 years that I chaired the Counterterrorism Committee, we regularly took what seemed like nutty ideas, such as the US Navy shot down TWA 800, and investigated them, ran them to ground completely. Some cases we were able to run them to ground completely, and some cases we were not. I talk about in the book the case that people made that sounded nutty, that there was a relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Oklahoma City bombing. And at first blush, that just sounds absurd, but when we looked into it, there was some smoke there, and we were never able to disprove it. So as far as I'm concerned, there's an open case. But we were, I think, good analysts. I think we were doing due diligence, and anytime anybody made a case that we were going down the wrong path analytically, we tried to find out whether or not we were.
Let me go to my last question, and then we're going to go to the audience. Back from the hearing, first Dick Clark.
I welcome these hearings because of the opportunity they provide to the American people to better understand why the tragedy of 9/11 happened and what we must do to prevent a reoccurrence. I also welcome the hearings because it is finally a forum where I can apologize to the loved ones of the victims of 9/11, to them who are here in the room, to those who are watching on television. Your government failed you. Those entrusted with protecting you failed you. And I failed you. We tried hard, but that doesn't matter because we failed. And for that failure, I would ask, once all the facts are out, for your understanding and for your forgiveness.
At last week's press conference, President Bush was asked, in effect, this question. The question was, what was your biggest mistake? And the president said that he wished he had gotten the written question ahead of time. So if you had been advising President Bush before this press conference, how would you have prepared him to answer that question?
You know, I grew up here in Cambridge and Boston, and I was on a debating team for one of the Boston high schools. And
Not just one of the Boston high schools, Boston Latin, yes.
That one. And the one piece of advice I ever remember getting from my debate coach was never deny the obvious. And I think that's a piece of advice that a number of people who went before the 9/11 Commission and those who are going together next week might bear in mind. Look, I think on the issue of apologies, I think everybody, it's not something that you do if you don't believe in it. If you can't genuinely say it and feel it and believe it, then you ought not to do it. And it's quite clear, I think, that the president and others feel that they have nothing to apologize for, and therefore they shouldn't apologize if they don't feel it. I worked a lot in the Clinton administration with families of victims of terrorism, particularly Pan Am 103, but also the embassy bombings in Oklahoma City and whatnot. when a tragedy like that happens in your family, when you recover, you want to communicate with the government. And you want that government to have a face. And you want that government to know your face and the face of your dead loved one. And I think it is part of the obligation of government when it doesn't succeed in preventing terrorist attacks to care for the widows and the orphans, not only in terms of their financial status, but of their psychological status, and their emotional status. And I think we tried very hard in the Clinton administration, particularly under Janet Reno's leadership, to do that. And I think it's just part of the role of the government to recognize that it has an obligation to the victims' families. And whether that obligation extends to personal apologies or not is entirely up to the individuals.
Okay. Let me take this to the audience here, and let me ask if David Gergen has a question, but then line up at the, since his file has been opened here tonight, line up at the microphones, which are 2 on the ground floor and 2 on the boxes, I think, and that's it. David.
Well, first of all, Richard, let me say thank you on behalf of the community here for taking your time to come here tonight. We very much appreciate this opportunity to hear from you directly. I have actually 2 questions. One is, did you learn anything new from the Bob Woodward book? And secondly, in an earlier stage, you wrote out a strategy for dealing with terrorism. What strategy would you recommend now for the country so that's an embracing approach of how we deal with this, other than just simply chasing down cells? How do we deal with this over the long haul?
Yeah. I haven't read all of the Woodward book yet, and I think from what I have seen, there's no real revelation there, I don't think. He makes clear that the president was intent on going to war with Iraq, and that the vice president was very influential in that struggle, and the president has a somewhat messianic view about the whole thing. And that's, I don't think, should come as a surprise to anybody. With regard to the issue of a strategy, the strategies that we developed in 1998 and 99 and 2000, and the one that was developed in 2001, which is essentially the same thing, we tried to be more than tactical. We tried to do more than just talk about arresting people and killing people. But we did not articulate well a strategy for winning the battle of ideas. And if you view the current problem as a civil war within Islam, which I think is the right analysis, where a small deviant minority within Islam, but a growing minority, a growing popularity, is winning within its own world the battle of ideas. And the United States is losing the battle of ideas, not just because we went into Iraq, not just. We had a problem winning the battle of ideas in the Islamic world and sections of the Islamic world before we went into Iraq. Iraq exacerbated it. I don't have a prescription for how we win the battle of ideas. It's not my area of expertise. Don't know. Hard problem. Seriously. I think we can do a service of saying we understand what the problem is, even if we don't know what the solution is. And we shouldn't be afraid to identify the problem because we don't know what the solution is. But the problem, in my mind, over the long term, is how do we persuade the probably millions of people in the Islamic world who now believe in the jihadist movement, as articulated by bin Laden and others. How do we persuade them that they're wrong? How do we persuade them not to give money to the cause, not to harbor people, not to support people? There's a very, very tiny group that are actually going to go out and kill people, but they swim in the sea of this larger population that does support the ideology. And until we turn the tide and start reducing the number of people who believe in this jihadist ideology, we're not going to win. And so we need to think about how to do that. People say the United States can't possibly get involved in religion. Well, I wasn't around in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but it does seem, reading the history, that the United States had a little bit of a hand in creating things called Christian democratic parties in Europe. And maybe those Christian democratic parties got a little CIA money, and maybe they were successful in preventing countries like Italy from becoming communist, Greece and whatnot. It's a different challenge, since we're not largely Islamic as a country. Different challenge for us to know how to deal with this problem. But it can't be beyond our capabilities, and we have to be able to try. And we have to do more than just creating a US government-funded version of MTV in Arabic.
For students thinking about a good problem to work on, I mean, Dick has, I think, as is usual, this straightforward way to say, here's a problem. He can tell the name of it. He can tell the shape of it, but he cannot tell the solution to it. So that's an opportunity. Please identify yourself, and hereafter, just one question to a customer, please.
My name is Marika McCauley. I'd like to thank you for your honesty and your courage in your statements before the 9/11 Commission. I agree with you on 2 points that you made tonight. Number one, that bin Laden is an incredibly intelligent person. Number two, that it's very likely that they'll attack again in the United States. So my question for you is, who do you think bin Laden would prefer to see as president, Bush or Kerry? And given that, based on your answer to that question, how do you think they'll time the next attack?
Yeah. After the attacks in Madrid, which clearly were designed to influence the election, an awful lot of people in Washington began saying that, my God, we're having an election too. What if they tried to do it, influence our election through attacks? And Condi Rice, in fact, said this, I think, on some of the Sunday talk shows last Sunday. Before that, the FBI director had said that there was a possibility that they'll do this. And when these discussions started, I asked the question that you just asked me, and I got sort of derisive laughter when I asked the question. It's not obvious to me, and I don't think it should be laughed at. When you ask the question, who does bin Laden and the movement want as president of the United States? I don't know the answer to that. I can make a very persuasive case, I think, either way. And for those of you who don't think that he would want George Bush has been very good to bin Laden's movement.
Yeah, I think the hard thing is to make the other case. Your analysis would say, who has been the most successful recruiter bin Laden ever had? I'm just saying your analysis.
Yeah.
So the implication of it should lead you to a fairly clear answer.
You could. I think it's a stronger case, frankly, that he would want. In terms of assuming that the movement has an ability to time attacks in the United States, big assumption. Don't know that that's true. Assuming that they have the ability to do that, the closer to the election, I think, and I'm not there are many people in this audience who are much more students of American politics than I am, but it would seem to me the closer to the election, the more likely it is that the attack would help the incumbent.
Please.
My name is Herman Soot. I'm at the medical school. I also would like to say I enjoyed your comments. But my question to you is, this is kind of a follow-up of David Gergen's comment. I would like to know if you're aware at any time if the president or any of his close advisors ever, for 1 second, address the very critical question of what it is that we're doing that so inflames the rage of Muslims against us. Well, I have never heard any of the speeches where they even intimated that they're aware that we might be doing something.
Well, I think to give them a little bit of credit, I think a number of people, including the vice president, have been acutely aware that there is a problem of stability in many of the Arab regimes that are friendly to the United States. I think they worry a lot about the future of the House of Saud. I think they worry a lot about the future of Egypt after President Mubarak. So I do think they're concerned that particularly Arab countries within the Islamic world do have a potential for becoming extremely anti-American and perhaps even having their governments become anti-American through an overthrow. They worry about what happened in Iran in 1979, happening in Saudi Arabia, happening in Egypt, indeed happening in a non-Arab country, Pakistan. They realize that one of the reasons that there is discontent in those countries and hatred against the United States is that those regimes which are friendly to the United States and which we have embraced are oftentimes oppressive and anti-democratic. And the president did give a speech, I think at AEI, in which he said, we want democracy to flourish in the Middle East. The only problem was having that speech come from this president after the invasion of Iraq, it fell totally on deaf ears in the Arab world. I think they were right in identifying the problem. That's one of the problems, the lack of democracy in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. But just as they had a goal of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, but no plan for doing what would happen on the next day, I fear that they have a goal of overthrowing, frankly, Jim Woolsey has talked openly about this, overthrowing the Saudi government. But I don't think they have a good plan for how they would move from these oppressive regimes like the Saudi government, like the Egyptian government, to friendly and democratic governments. I don't think they've thought out that transition.
Here in the left balcony, please.
Good evening. My name is Christine Wheatley. I would like to expand on a couple of the other questions that have been asked regarding, I would like, Mr. Clark, if you could talk about what would be an appropriate response, not just by the United States, but by Europe, by the global community, not just in terms of strategy in dealing with Al-Qaeda, but also in regards to, you spoke of, over 70% of the Islamic community, quote, hates the United States, that President Bush did the exact opposite of what he should have done by invading Iraq, not just in terms of strategy, but ideology and in terms of how we present ourselves to the world. What can the US as well as Europe and the global community do to address not just Al-Qaeda, but the ideology that they are presenting and inflaming?
Well, it would be very helpful if we had some prominent and articulate Islamic leaders, particularly religious leaders, who we could look to as counterweights. We don't really have that. And it's very difficult for us as the United States government to create the Islamic Billy Graham. But we kind of need that. And beyond that, there are some obvious things some of which we've begun to do to remove the irritants in the relationship. We have now removed US military forces from Saudi Arabia. Not because bin Laden wanted us to, demanded that we do it, but because it made sense, both from our own military posture and for the stability of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, we have to do something about the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Now, frankly, even if we solved it, which is very, very difficult, obviously, that's not going to improve overnight our relationship with the jihadist movement. They'll find something else to complain about. So it's not sufficient that we solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem, but it is necessary.
Let's go to this gentleman, please.
Mr. Clark, the Pakistan is an important factor in this equation. And Osama bin Laden is said to be hiding still in the western part of Pakistan somewhere. Although President Musharraf has assured us he is with us, but ISI, who are the real creators of Taliban and Osama bin Laden, what is their position? Are they still with us? Are they still with the Taliban? You probably have more information than I have. Would you please comment on this?
Well, I think you point to a real problem, and what you're saying is that there's reason to believe that the one of the Pakistani intelligence services is riddled with Al-Qaeda sympathizers. Certainly that was the case when I was in government. I assume it is less so today, because I think President Musharraf has finally realized we were right when we told him that. And more importantly, President Musharraf has also realized they're trying to kill him, which has motivated him enormously. But I think it's indicative of the problem that we have not only members of the Pakistani intelligence service, we have members of the Pakistani military, we have obviously now members of the Pakistani nuclear physics establishment, who actually have some sympathy, some considerable sympathy, with the jihadist Al-Qaeda movement. In the two northwest provinces of Pakistan, when there have recently been democratic elections, the political parties that have won look a lot like Al-Qaeda by another name. So I like to believe, and I said several times here already, that we're talking about a small minority in Islam that supports the jihadist movement. But it's possible it's not just a small minority. And it's possible that there are people not only in the Pakistani intelligence service and military, but in the Saudi military, according to some reports, who are very much sympathizers of Al-Qaeda. I think that points to the dimensions of the problem. And here you have a situation where one of the reasons people are moving to the jihadist movement is there is an oppressive, non-democratic government in a place like Pakistan. But on the other hand, temporarily, for the short term, our best hope in fighting Al-Qaeda turns out to be to use that military government. And in fact, if there were a general election in Pakistan, I suspect we wouldn't like the outcome. So again, I don't have the answer, but you're quite right in saying that that is the problem, that we are having to rely on intelligence services and military services in, quote, friendly countries in the region, where many of the people in the intelligence services and military are not friendly at all.
Please.
Lala Kadir, Kennedy School. A few weeks ago, Robert McNamara was in the same seat as you are presently, being interviewed by Professor Allison on his comments in the fog of war. And one of his takeaways from his experiences as SecDef was the centrality of empathy, specifically empathizing with the enemy in order to understand them and ultimately to defeat them. Do you agree with his assessment? And if so, how would you empathize with the terrorist?
Yeah, I do. I do agree with this assessment. I think we have to get inside the head of the enemy, whether that's called empathy or not. We do have to understand their value system and where they got their value system and how we can affect their value system. Not just the value system of the person who's driving the truck bomb, because it's probably too late to affect that, but this larger population that supports them. And that means understanding the cultures much better than we do. One of my great regrets in the post 9/11 security environment in which we live is that we have greatly reduced the number of people from Islamic countries coming to universities in the United States. It is folly, it is self-defeating, it is shooting ourselves in the foot on so many levels. But at the same time, we're not sending a lot of our people to their universities. And we need that cross-cultural exchange. And we need, if we're going to get inside, not just the head of the enemy, but inside the mindset of the populations with which we have to deal. And it's not just a matter of taking people to the Defense Language Institute and teaching them Urdu. You can speak Urdu and not understand Pakistan. We really need to do a much better job of creating not only language awareness, but cultural awareness with these countries. Because frankly, I mean, we have people now, CIA people, going to places like Iraq. We have a large number of CIA people now in Iraq who not only don't speak Arabic, but have never been in an Arab country before. So, yeah, we've got a much better job to do.
And lots of them who look like you and me, as opposed to normal people in those countries. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if the usefulness of secrecy has changed completely since the problem with terrorism. I mean, our intelligence services were developed during the Cold War, which was a very different espionage game. A lot of people have made the point that if that famous memo from that Arizona FBI agent about possible extremists training to be pilots had simply been public information, that thousands of Americans would have connected the dots. I'm wondering if you would consider, in your next incarnation, a weekly terrorist weather report. I'd love to tune into that. Obviously, the problem then becomes, you know, what is truly an important secret, but shouldn't a lot more of this information just be public?
Yeah, it should be. Absolutely, it should be. And frankly, it is. And one of the things I've learned since I've left the government is that you can get almost as much information, in some ways more information, from publicly available sources. And there are daily terrorism web pages published by organizations ranging from ABC News, where I do actually help write the daily web page on terrorism, to something called the Investigative Project, run by Steve Emerson, who wrote the book Jihad in America. You know, while I was in the White House and frustrated with the lack of ability to get answers to questions about what was going on in the United States, I actually turned to this investigative project and Steve Emerson and said, what can you tell me? Let's take, for example, about where there are web servers that are hosting pages soliciting money for terrorist groups. Because if any of those web pages are in the United States, on servers in the United States, that's a violation of federal law, soliciting money for terrorist groups. And I had asked that question to the FBI, and they said, oh, there aren't any. And I asked that question of Steve Emerson, and I had 17 of them half an hour later. So you can learn a lot from open source material, and a number of people are doing that. George Tenet and I think Bob Mueller both understand that. I know George does, and has been trying to inculcate into the agency that open source material is as good and frequently better than classified material. Think about it. What is the source of human intelligence, of a spy report? It's a report that somebody gave you because you paid them for it. Or in the case of Mr. Chalabi, you know, some other motivation. So there's really no reason to believe that necessarily the classified information is better, but we've taught several generations of CIA and FBI analysts that it is. And you know, they need to come to a place like this and spend a year where they can't use classified information to footnote their papers and learn that there's an awful lot of information out there. Please.
Hi, my name is Brian Farkhoff. I'm actually a graduate of Boston Latin. So it's good to see you here. Thank you for coming. I don't want to dwell on the ideology question. I think it's been asked actually a couple of times right before me. But I just can't get it out of my head that there's a question of, there seems to be something we're missing. And I was wondering if you could characterize as, I don't know, concisely as possible, what exactly is the ideology that we're missing in our cultural exchange? I mean, because sometimes, I mean, I'm a young guy, I'm educating myself, and sometimes I can't help but wonder if they're just so anti-American in everything that we believe, then, you know, forgive me for saying, I know I'm in Cambridge, but why isn't Bush's strategy right, you know? What keeps us from asking that question, and what keeps us from answering in the affirmative if we really aren't trying to understand, you know?
No, I understand what you're saying, and there is no one place you can go and say, there is the Das Kapital, the Mein Kampf of this movement. But there are some things that are pretty close in the writings of bin Laden and others. And I think different audiences within their support network resonate with different themes in the ideology. Some of it is just anti-Americanism, yeah, sure, because we're the world's only remaining superpower. Some of it probably is related to Palestine, although I doubt it very much, that most of them really care about Palestine. Some of it, though, really is based on this, frankly, Wahhabist view of Islam, where they believe that everyone, many of them believe, that everyone needs to be converted to Islam, even at the point of a sword. And you know, they have this poster where they show green areas, or areas that are under the control of the caliphate. And at the time that they first did this, it was Sudan and Afghanistan. And then it projected it out in 25 years what it would be. And it was a much larger area, including all of the Arabian Peninsula and most of Pakistan and whatnot. And then they had the third map, which was 100 years later, and the entire world was in green. Now, I know it sounds silly. You know, whenever any of these ideological movements, whether it's communism or fascism or anything, talks about world domination, you know, we all just sort of laugh. But they're not laughing. They are, many of them, devoted to this idea of creating a caliphate, a fundamentalist Islamic theocracy world government. But you're right, we need to better understand and disaggregate all of the motivations that different groups have. But at the far extreme, at least some of them are looking for, at the point of a gun, world conversion to Islam. And not just Islam, but this bizarrest interpretation of Islam.
Thank you. This, unfortunately, will have to be the last question here on the left.
Question about counterterrorism and the Patriot Act. Since the Millennium bombing plots and a few other terrorist actions were foiled, without the Patriot Act, in part under your guidance, it's sometimes argued that the tools provided by the Patriot Act weren't necessary. The existing tools, if diligently applied, were accurate, and what we needed was diligent. It's never been clear to me that you agreed with that. So I'm wondering if you do, and whether we need more of the same in terms of Patriot Act type stuff or less.
Well, let me begin with a confession that for a long time, while I was in the White House, like the former governor of Massachusetts, I was a card-carrying member of the ACLU. Didn't tell very many people that, nonetheless. And I did that because I believe strongly in civil liberties. If you believe strongly in civil liberties, what is the thing that you should do today to protect civil liberties? I would argue that the thing that you should do today that most protects civil liberties in this country is to help prevent another major terrorist attack. Because no matter how many of us send checks to the ACLU, if there's another major terrorist attack in this country on the order of the World Trade Center, or if there's a sustained campaign, as there has been in so many countries, hold on to that Bill of Rights because it's going fast. So be very, very careful about opposing things like the Patriot Act. I know this is counterintuitive, but if you believe in civil liberties, you've got to stop that next big attack. I've read the Patriot Act. I actually helped write some of it. I've gone back several times now since I've been out of the government and reread it, and I can't find anything wrong with it. And if I had had it prior to 9/11, it would have been a hell of a lot easier to stop 9/11. I know you don't like that answer, but okay. Good. Yeah.
Let me say two final quick points. First, for those of you who didn't hear earlier today, Larry Summers has appointed a new dean of the Kennedy School. It's our own local David Elwood, and we're very proud of that. And secondly, as part of the marvelous and continuing feast at the Kennedy School, David Gergen is going to be in Starr Auditorium, which is just down the hall here, at 7:45 with Eric Shinseki, who was the former U.S. Army Chief of Staff, who happened, when in that job, to say, when asked before the Senate how many troops he thought would be required to manage post-conflict in Iraq, his answer was several 100,000 for some extended period of time. So General Shinseki will be in Starr Auditorium with David Gergen at 7:45. So thanks very much to Dick Clark. Really great.